Page 133. Sophie reached down to their outstretched hands from the compartment window, but their fingers did not meet. Her father smiled confidently as he withdrew his hand and blew her a kiss. They walked beside her, at first keeping pace with the train. When they began to fall behind, though, step by step, they eventually stopped, and Sophie saw the train's rounding belly finally push her parents from view. There had been a great effort to hold her tears, trying to believe what her parents had told her, that they all would see one another again soon. The three had dressed for the occasion. Her mother's dark blue hat was tilted just so, her double-breasted jacket fastened tightly at the neck, her chin held high with resolve. Sophie knew this journey had been forced upon her as a result of the star painted in white on the front of her father's music shop. He feared the men roaming the streets, shattering windows and knocking people down. He said it was not safe for her here. When the problems eased, she would return. She would be sent for when these men were rounded up and brought before the courts, when things got back to normal. Her father, a luthier, had learned his trade from his father, and his father before him had learned it from his. This shop sat on a quiet street called Hildestrasse in the old quarter near the temple. When she was a child, one of Sophie's greatest pleasures had been to sit at the shop's front window and feel the sun warm her face, and listen to her father working in the back while her mother dusted the completed instruments or knitted patiently, waiting for customers. The air was always rich with the smells of distant hardwood forests and the stains that were used on their precious wood. Before she had learned to speak, her nose had been able to distinguish oily East Asian teak from the South American rosewoods and ebonies that her father kept stacked in neat piles in the storeroom. Slowly, back there in his workshop, he shaped 500-year-old planks into instruments of perfect tone and astonishing beauty. Violins mostly, but cellos and guitars too, which were later strung and sold to the town's klezmer musicians and students from the conservatory and members of the Lynx Orchestra. On that train she sat across from a fat man in a gray suit with a double chin. She did not want to speak. She watched him lay out a blue-checked handkerchief on his lap and carve a piece of sausage with a penknife, then a big yellow apple, and pop both into his mouth at the same time. He chewed with his eyes staring straight ahead. The train cut slowly north through the delicious spring-green pastures of Swabia, through Augsburg to Stuttgart, and on again into the Odenwald. Sophie believed she saw the fabled Black Forest in the large, dark storm front that approached from France. She imagined crooked-backed shoemakers pulling water from the deep, cold wells, and the bud-shaped hands of the elves known to live there. She knew the fairy tales of this Germany, enchanted and dark, but not long for this world, like a taste of sweet jam on her tongue. The pleasures of her excitement when she had read those stories of lurking monsters and club-footed dungeon-men and magic weavers and lonely kings returned to her as the darkness gathered on the western hills and the train continued north. Wasn't she herself one of those heroines lost in the wilderness? She hoped for the good fortune she heard about often enough in those stories her mother had read to her years before. She remembered also the meanness, the men who ate the bones of children and then tried not to look at the man across from her who had since finished his meal and fallen asleep. That night, in Frankfort am Main, a porter shook her awake and told her she must change trains. 10 hours later she awoke to a taste in the air she had never smelt before. Her back was sore from the journey. Her eyes were tired and burning. She could think only of food and of her already distant mother and father. She rose from her couchette and turned to the window, and there, beyond the gridwork of metal trees, which soon cleared in her eyes to become loading cranes, beyond, crates the size of houses and large grey ships the size of apartment blocks, dark and high in the water. Beyond this tangle of metal and steam and men in overalls and the single gunship emerging out her train window to the right, she saw the long, narrow finger of the sea pointing deep inland, ending where she was now. The train whistles blew, and the station outside her window blurred in a mass of pink and white faces, until the carriage once more jumped and finally settled and seemed to sink ever so slightly into its tracks, fused to the metal of the rails under her feet. The sign outside her window announced Hamburg. People shouted and more whistles blew. Sophie gathered up her bags, then found the porter who had shaken her awake, and asked which exit she would take for the port. Later that morning she boarded the St. Louis, along with 930 others, who had no reason to believe their entry visas to Cuba would not be honored. The crossing did not erase the pervading image of home from her thoughts, or the pain of leaving her parents behind. She hid herself from the hard winds of the North Atlantic, and when those winds turned warm and the sun became persistent and welcoming, she hid from them too. One day the island appeared outside the small porthole in her cabin, and she beheld the pale blue arbor and the low brown city, confident and lazy under the May sun. For 2 weeks they remained at anchor. She saw palms moving slowly in the wind and small dark figures at work on the shore. They straightened their backs and waved to the distant ship as they smoked and shuffled their feet. With amazement she watched what she had been told would be her new home, and heard her mother's voice inside her head. Confident and soothing it floated behind her right ear. "Do not give up hope," it said. And her father's clean, smooth face, smelling of bath-water and soap, came to her. For some reason she sensed his presence here, sitting now at the edge of her bed, and realized that the headboard was of spruce, and she was suddenly back there among the comforting smells of her father's shop. She cried herself to sleep every night aboard the ship. She remembered the simple mornings before going off to school, how her father would cradle her face in his rough, calloused hands and sing "My Princess and Me," or "Upsala, Upsala, 1, 2, 3." She remembered the sweet smell of his bath soap, which was never diminished at the end of the day, but mixed with wood smells he returned home with. Now there was only the strange smell of the sea and the promise and threat of an unknown city somewhere at the end of this journey. Now there was only the strange smell of the sea and the promise and threat of an unknown city somewhere at the end of this journey, its odd rhythms and smell of fried plantains and dark tobacco drifting like an unwelcome promise through her dreams. She awoke on the third morning into the second week of waiting with an unknown stickiness to her legs, as if someone had stolen in during the night and spread her lower body with honey and jam. She placed her hand on her belly, then between her legs. She opened her eyes in the morning light of her single room, and found a griminess there she had not seen before. She removed the hand and examined it closely, then smiled. She knew what this was. She sat up in bed, pulled back the covers, and inching away from the dark stain on the sheet, looked at the full length of her body. She walked to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror and examined this new wetness on her thighs. The air was almost heavy with her body's smells. She could not stop the flow, and watched as a small dark bead searched its way down over the pale winter skin of her right leg. Below her belly button the slight shadow of pubic hair was matted flat against her body. In a burst of confidence she put her hands on her hips and smiled into the mirror. She cupped her small breasts in her sticky hands and lifted and tried to look like her favorite movie star. She laughed and turned in a circle and felt the dark bead spin off and saw it splatter against the enamel of the bath. After she got cleaned up and dressed, she took the sheets and held them to her chest in a large rumpled ball and stood in the middle of the room, wondering what to do with them. Of course, she did not want them discovered. She did not want a stranger to take these sheets from her and let it be known that this had happened to her here on a ship of strangers, alone with this delirious secret. And it was then that she remembered where she was, trapped in solitude, and she sat on the edge of her bed and cried. There were new rumors every day. Tuesday they were landing. Wednesday they were sailing on to New York. Thursday a German U-boat had entered the harbor and was preparing to sink them right there and then. Friday they'd be steaming back to Hamburg. Saturday Roosevelt was arriving that very evening to take personal control of the situation. There were reports of spies on board. She had sat in the cafeteria over an unfinished plate of rice and baked fish and listened to four men talk of plans to seize the ship and steam for Miami. Already one man, a tall, thin Jew from Cologne, had slit his wrists and thrown himself into the harbor. Could he possibly have known, she wondered, of some terrible fate arranged for them all? Why would a man do such a thing if he hadn't been assured a death worse than drowning? But he had been fished out, treated, and returned to the ship, and was now, she figured, condemned to see what he thought his eyes could not bear. Smuggled newspapers found their way on to the St. Louis. She decoded their headlines with the rudiments of English she'd learned from her mother. In Linz she was accustomed to reading the words Juden and Ross in the same article. She was surprised to find no such words now, only diplomacy, unresolved, and international in the copies of the New York Times and the Miami Herald. She found ripped and tattered, discarded in stairwells, or pushed slowly over the wooden deck by a hot Cuban wind. La Repubblica she understood hardly at all, but her smattering of Latin helped. In any case, she preferred the American papers. Soon she found herself looking more at photographs of movie actors and for incidental pictures of American life than for news that might determine the ultimate destination of this voyage. Nearing the end of the second week, at anchor, she noticed a stiffness in her fingers she had never felt before. She was sitting in one of the cafeterias, watching the island through a port side window, when a mild paralysis seized them like a clenched fist. She stretched her arms out against the table and watched a paleness begin at the tips and creep up their length in a strange constriction. In a short while the ghostly shade had turned a light ocean blue, cool to the touch when she tested her fingers against her cheek. In another climate she might have suspected it to be frostbite. Her first thought was of her period, wondering if there could be a connection. Maybe there were so many strange events that happened under the skin at this time in a young woman's life that you could not be expected to foresee every twist and blood-letting turn. Strange and unseemly events might occur, particularly to each person, that her mother had not been able to prepare her for. My dear, your fingers will become numb and pass from pink to pale to blue. She retired to her room when the blue became noticeable, and she detected alarm in people's faces. Someone might insist she see a doctor, a kind old man who was unfamiliar with the intimacies of the female body. This man would probe her, putting his fingers where even her own were too timid to search. While she sat on the edge of her bed, imagining this assault, the blue of her fingers turned deathly, which then brought to mind the reason she had been placed on this ship of strangers destined for the New World. She lay back on the cramped bed and closed her eyes. Maybe she was dying, she thought for the first time in her life. Maybe she was already dead. The mind holding on a few moments longer, able to observe the tide lowering as life was drained from her body. Maybe this was death's great secret, its one last offering to the passing soul. But she knew she was not dead when the fingers began to throb again. All the blood that had been absent seemed to rush outwards on the verge of exploding, filling her fingers with pain. She lost all desire to understand the mystery of this condition, consumed as she was by the fire it had sparked. She did not want to solve the riddle, just that it would stop. That was all she needed. That would be enough. And slowly, as though someone had been listening, waiting for this simple request, "Please make it stop," the burning sensation cooled by degrees, and her hands again became hers.